The highway stretches ahead like a gray ribbon laid across an ocean of sagebrush and stone. On either side, the Nevada desert rolls out in long, slow waves of brown and gold, broken only by the occasional skeletal juniper or the distant spine of a mountain range that shimmers in the heat. The pavement is old, cracked in places, patched in others, and the white line down the center has faded to a ghostly suggestion. There are no gas stations for miles, no signs of civilization except for the occasional rusted mailbox or the skeleton of a homestead that long ago surrendered to the wind and the sun. This is the forgotten highway across Nevada, a road that once carried thousands of travelers, dreamers, and desperate souls from one end of the country to the other, but now lies quiet, almost invisible, as if the land itself has decided to swallow it back. I first heard about this road from an old man in a diner in Elko. He was nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and his hands were stained with grease and dust. He told me that when he was a boy, his father used to drive this highway in a rattling Ford truck, hauling supplies from Salt Lake City to Reno. In those days, the road was alive. Every few miles there was a gas station, a diner, or a motel with a blinking neon sign that promised a warm bed and a hot meal. The travelers came in waves. Families in station wagons headed for the California coast, truckers hauling lumber and cattle, salesmen with sample cases full of brushes and kitchen gadgets. But then the interstate came, a wide, smooth ribbon of concrete that bypassed the little towns and straightened the curves. The old highway was left to wither. The gas stations closed one by one. The diners boarded up their windows. The motels became nesting grounds for swallows and mice. And the road itself began to crumble, not from neglect but from a kind of quiet forgetting, as if the world had simply moved on and left it behind. To understand this forgotten highway, you have to go back to a time when Nevada was not a place you passed through, but a barrier you had to cross. Before the railroads, before the interstate system, the journey from the East Coast to the West was a gamble with weather, terrain, and human endurance. The first roads were little more than wagon ruts, carved by pioneers heading for the gold fields of California. Those ruts still exist in places, faint scars on the desert floor, visible only from the air or when the sun is low and casts long shadows. By the early 20th century, a movement grew to create a true national highway, a road that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific and bind the country together. That road was called the Lincoln Highway, named after Abraham Lincoln, and it was the first transcontinental highway in the United States. It ran from Times Square in New York City to Lincoln Park in San Francisco, crossing 12 states and covering more than 3,000 miles. But of all the segments along that route, none was more desolate, more demanding, and more storied than the stretch across Nevada. The Lincoln Highway entered Nevada from the east, near the town of Wendover, which straddles the Utah border. From there, it headed west across the Salt Flats, the Bonneville Salt Flats, a white, blinding expanse that seemed to go on forever. In the early days, crossing those flats was a nightmare. The salt crust could be razor-sharp in some places and soft as quicksand in others. Drivers had to carry extra tires, planks of wood to lay under the wheels, and enough water to last for days. Beyond the salt flats, the highway climbed into the mountains, twisting through narrow passes and dropping into valleys that were either scorching hot or bone cold, depending on the season. The towns along the route were few and far between: Elko, Carlin, Battle Mountain, Winnemucca, Lovelock, Fernley. Each of these places grew up around the highway, serving the travelers with food, fuel, and a place to rest. The highway was their lifeline, the only thread that connected them to the outside world. But the forgotten highway is more than just pavement and gravel. It is a repository of stories, of people who lived and died along its length, of ambitions that soared and crashed against the hard reality of the desert. One of those stories belongs to a woman named Ruth, who ran a roadside cafe just west of Austin, Nevada. Austin was a small mining town that had seen better days, but Ruth's cafe was a beacon. She served pie, coffee, and hamburgers from a grill that had been seasoned with decades of grease and smoke. Truckers would pull in at 3 in the morning, and she would have hot coffee waiting. Families would stop to stretch their legs, and she would point them toward the little church of the desert, a tiny white building that still stands near the highway. Ruth ran that cafe for 40 years, until the interstate opened and the traffic vanished. She tried to hold on, but the bank took the building, and she moved to a small apartment in Reno. She told me that sometimes, late at night, she can still hear the sound of tires on the gravel, the rumble of diesel engines, the laughter of children who were on their way to see the ocean for the first time. Then there is the story of the ghost town of Goldfield, which lies south of the main line of the Lincoln Highway, but along a spur that once connected to it. Goldfield was a boomtown at the turn of the century, a place where silver and gold were pulled from the earth by the ton. The highway brought miners, speculators, and saloon keepers. At its peak, Goldfield had a population of more than 20,000 people, with opera houses, hotels, and a red light district that rivaled any in the West. But the ore ran out and the highway moved away. Today, Goldfield is a skeleton of its former self. A few hundred people live there in buildings that lean against the wind. The streets are dirt. The old courthouse is a museum, but most of the town is empty lots where buildings once stood. The forgotten highway passes within a few miles, but no one stops. The highway itself seems to hurry past, as if it is ashamed of what it left behind. The landscape along the forgotten highway is a character in its own right. It is a land of extremes, where the temperature can swing from 100 degrees in the day to near freezing at night. The sky is enormous, a dome of blue that seems to press down on the earth. The silence is profound, broken only by the wind and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. In the spring, the desert blooms with wildflowers, patches of yellow and purple that appear for a few weeks and then vanish. In the winter, snow can cover the highway, closing it for days at a time. The road itself is a study in contrasts. In some places, it is smooth and straight, a testament to the engineering of a century ago. In others, it is washboarded and rutted, the asphalt broken by frost heaves and the roots of sagebrush that have pushed through the surface. Driving it requires attention and patience. You cannot rush. You cannot take your eyes off the road because the road itself demands your respect. One of the most remarkable features of the Forgotten Highway is the loneliest road in America sign that now marks the route. The sign is ironic because the road is indeed lonely. The interstate carries most of the traffic, leaving the old highway to the locals, the adventurers, and the lost. There are long stretches where you can drive for an hour without seeing another car. The towns that remain along the route have become husks of their former selves. The gas stations are automated, accepting only credit cards. The diners serve sandwiches that taste of the microwave. The motels have flickering neon signs that read vacancy, but the windows are dark. It is a ghostly experience, moving through these places where tens of thousands of people once passed, and now you are the only traveler for miles. There is a particular stretch of the highway between the town of Eureka and the town of Ely that captures the spirit of the forgotten road. It is a high desert plateau, studded with pinon pine and juniper, and the road winds through a series of valleys that seem to have no end. The asphalt is narrow, barely wide enough for two cars to pass. The shoulders are soft gravel, and if you drift off the pavement, you risk a slide into the ditch. At night, there are no lights, no signs, no landmarks except for the stars and the occasional pair of glowing eyes in the sagebrush. It is easy to imagine the travelers of the One Night with Zeros, their headlights weak and flickering, their cars unreliable, their nerves on edge as they pushed on into the darkness. They carried cans of gasoline on the running boards, spare tires strapped to the back, and water in canvas bags that leaked and left a musty smell in the air. They stopped when they had to, camping beside the road, building small fires to cook a meal of beans and bacon, and sleeping on the ground under the endless sky. The Forgotten Highway also carries the memory of the Pony Express, which used a similar route across Nevada in the 1860s. The riders would change horses at stations spaced every 10 or 15 miles, and they would push on through snow and heat and hostile territory. The stations are gone now, marked only by plaques and piles of stones. But the spirit of those riders lingers in the wind. There is a feeling along this road that you are not alone, that the ghosts of the past are traveling alongside you. Maybe it is the imagination playing tricks, or maybe it is the deep resonance of a place that has been used and abandoned again. Every mile of the highway is layered with the stories of people who came before, and the road itself seems to remember them. As you drive west, the landscape changes. The sagebrush gives way to the alkali flats of the Humboldt Sink, a vast, dry lake bed that was once a sea. The highway crosses the Humboldt River, a ribbon of water that snakes through the desert, lined with cottonwood trees that turn gold in the fall. The river was a lifeline for the pioneers, a source of water and timber and shade. The highway follows it for much of the way, hugging its banks, then leaving it behind as it climbs toward the Sierra Nevada. But before you reach the mountains, you come to the town of Lovelock, named after the man who built a trading post there in the 1860s. Lovelock is a quiet place now, with a main street that looks like a movie set from the 1950s. The old courthouse is brick, the sidewalks are wide, and the trees are tall. The highway runs right through the middle of town, and if you blink, you might miss it. But once this was a bustling stop, where travelers could rest and resupply before the final push to the California line. The Forgotten Highway across Nevada is not just a road. It is a testament to human ambition, to the belief that with enough effort and courage, you can conquer any distance. It is also a reminder that time erases everything, that even the most vital arteries can wither and die. The road is still there, waiting, and if you take the time to drive it, you will find a world that has been left behind, a world of silence and space and stories. The asphalt is cracked, the paint is faded, but the road endures. It holds the memories of those who traveled it, and it waits for the next traveler to come along, to add a new story to the layer of dust that covers its surface. I set out to drive the forgotten highway from Wendover to the California border in a rented sedan, a small car that felt inadequate against the vastness of the landscape. I had a map, a cooler full of water and sandwiches, and a playlist of old country songs that my father used to play on road trips when I was a child. The first few miles were easy, the pavement smooth, the sky clear. But as I pushed deeper into the desert, the road began to change. The shoulders grew softer, the cracks wider. I passed a sign that said next service is 86 miles, and I realized that I was truly alone. The radio faded to static. The phone lost its signal. It was just me, the car, and the road. The sun was high and hot, and the air shimmered above the asphalt. I kept the windows down, letting the dry wind blow through the car. There was a smell of sage and dust and something else, something ancient and clean. I thought about the people who had come this way before, the pioneers in their wagons, the miners in their dusty boots, the families in their Packards and Studebakers, the truckers in their big rigs. They all had one thing in common. They were crossing this desert to get somewhere else. The road was not the destination. It was a means to an end. And yet, for all of them, the road itself became a destination, a place of memory and struggle and transformation. In the distance, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a trick of the light. But as I got closer, I realized it was a man, an old man with a long white beard and a tattered hat. He was holding a cardboard sign, but the writing was faded and I could not read it. I slowed down and pulled over, the gravel crunching under my tires. The man walked up to my window. His eyes were pale blue, like the sky after a rain. He smiled, and I saw that he had few teeth. He said, "You lost, son." I said I was not lost, that I was just driving the old highway. He nodded, as if that made perfect sense. He told me that he had been walking this road for 40 years, that he had walked it from one end to the other and back again, and that he knew every crack in the pavement, every rock, every shadow. He said that the road talks to you if you listen. I asked him what it says. He laughed, a dry, rasping sound, and said, "It says you are here." Then he turned and walked away, into the desert, toward a ridge of hills that looked like the backbone of a sleeping giant. I watched him until he disappeared into the heat, and then I drove on. That encounter stayed with me for the rest of the drive. It reminded me that the forgotten highway is not just a relic of the past. It is a living thing, a place where people still exist, where stories are still being written. The old man was a part of that story, as much as Ruth and the ghost town of Goldfield and the Pony Express riders. The highway holds them all, and it holds them together. It is a thread that connects the past to the present, the living to the dead, the traveler to the land. And as I drove, I felt myself becoming a part of that thread, a new strand woven into the fabric of the road. The miles passed. The landscape shifted from high desert to sagebrush plains to the rocky slopes of the Toyabe Range. I stopped in Austin, a small town perched on a hill, and walked through the old cemetery, where the gravestones told the stories of miners and schoolteachers and infants who died of fever. I found the grave of a man named John, who had been born in 1850 and died in 1912. The epitaph read, "He crossed the desert and found peace." I wondered what peace he had found and whether it was worth the crossing. I left Austin and continued west, the sun beginning to sink toward the horizon. The sky turned orange and pink and purple, a light show that seemed to go on forever. The highway caught the colors, and for a moment, it glowed like a river of fire. I reached the town of Fallon as the last light faded. Fallon is where the forgotten highway meets the interstate, a junction of old and new. The interstate is straight and wide and fast, a highway of the present, carrying cars and trucks at 70 miles per hour toward Reno and beyond. But the old highway arcs away from it, heading south then west toward the mountains. I stopped at a diner in Fallon, a place called the Oasis, where the waitress knew my order before I gave it. She said, "You driving the old road, huh? You going all the way to the coast?" I said yes, and she shook her head. "It's a long road," she said. "Lot of ghosts out there. You be careful." I ate my burger and fries, and then I went out to the car. The night was cool, the stars brilliant. I got back on the old highway, heading west into the dark. The road narrowed, the pavement roughened, and the headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the blackness. I drove for hours, past the town of Fernley, past the Pyramid Lake turnoff, past the ruins of the old mining camp at Olinghouse. The highway climbed into the Virginia mountains, a range that separates the desert from the Sierras. The road twisted and turned, and I had to slow to 30 miles per hour to navigate the curves. The trees closed in, pinon and juniper, and the smell of pine filled the air. I could feel the altitude rising in my ears. Somewhere ahead, the highway would crest the mountains and then begin the long descent into California. But that was for another day, another drive. For now, I was still in Nevada, still on the forgotten highway, still listening to the whispers of the road. The road kept climbing and the air grew thin and cold. I turned off the engine at a wide spot in the gravel, a pullout that overlooked a valley I could not see in the dark. I stepped out and stood still, letting the silence wash over me. There was no wind, no sound of insects, no distant hum of traffic, only the vast, empty dark of the Nevada night. I looked up at the stars, which were so numerous they seemed to crowd the sky, a thick blanket of light that made the blackness between them feel almost solid. I thought about the old man I had met earlier and his words, "The road says you are here." That was all. Not a promise of a destination, not a warning of danger, just a simple statement of presence. And standing there on that unseen ridge, I felt it. I was here in this moment, on this forgotten stretch of asphalt, suspended between a past I could never fully know and a future I could not yet see. When I got back in the car and continued west, the headlights picked out the faded white line that marked the center of the road. It was barely visible, worn down by years of sun and rain and neglect. I followed it blindly, trusting it to lead me through the curves and switchbacks. The road was narrow, barely 2 lanes, and in places the asphalt had crumbled at the edges, leaving a jagged margin of broken pavement. I had to concentrate to stay in the center, to avoid the loose gravel that had spilled onto the road from the shoulder. It was a meditation of sorts, a kind of focused attention that made the miles pass without my noticing. I was not thinking about work or home or the future. I was just driving, following the line, moving through the dark. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I came to a place called the town of Wadsworth, or what was left of it. There were a few scattered buildings, a gas station that looked like it had been closed for decades, and a single streetlight that cast a weak yellow glow over the intersection. I pulled over and got out again, stretching my legs. The air smelled of dust and old wood. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, a lonely sound that echoed off the hills. I walked down the main street, past a boarded-up storefront that still had a sign reading general merchandise. The paint was peeling, the windows were cracked, and the wooden porch sagged under the weight of time. I pressed my face to the glass and tried to see inside, but there was nothing to see, only shadows and the faint outlines of shelves that had long since been stripped bare. Wadsworth had once been a railroad town, a stop on the transcontinental line that stretched across the desert. The trains still passed through, I imagined, but they did not stop anymore. There was no reason to stop. The town had died slowly, the way so many small towns in Nevada had died, a little less each year as the interstate drew the life away. I thought about the people who had lived here, who had built their lives around this road and this railroad. They had raised children, buried their dead, celebrated holidays, fallen in love and grown old. And then, one by one, they had left or died, and the town had become a hollow shell, a monument to a way of life that no longer existed. But the road was still here, passing through the ghost of a town, and for a moment I felt like I was keeping vigil, honoring the memory of all those who had come before. I got back in the car and drove on, leaving Wadsworth behind. The sky began to lighten in the east, a pale gray that slowly turned to pink and then to gold. The sun rose over the mountains, casting long shadows across the desert floor. I pulled over again, this time to watch the sunrise. It was spectacular, as sunrises in the desert always are, a slow and deliberate unveiling of the world. The colors deepened and spread, and the rocks and sagebrush emerged from the darkness, each one sharp and distinct in the clear morning light. I had been driving for nearly 12 hours and I was tired, but the sunrise revived me. It reminded me that every day begins again, that the road will always lead somewhere, even if that somewhere is just another stretch of asphalt. By mid-morning, I reached the town of Fernley, a place that had managed to survive because it sat at the junction of two highways, the old one and the interstate. Fernley had a truck stop and a motel and a diner, and I stopped at the diner for breakfast. The waitress was a woman in her 60s, with gray hair and a kind smile. She brought me coffee and eggs and hash browns, and she asked where I was headed. I told her I was driving the old highway to the California border. She nodded as if she had heard that before. She said she had grown up in Fernley, that her father had been a truck driver who hauled supplies to the mining camps in the 1950s. He had driven the old highway every week, back when it was the only way to get there. She remembered riding with him in the cab of his truck, watching the desert scroll past the window. She said the road had been different then, smoother, better maintained, busier. There were more towns, more gas stations, more people. But it was still the same road, she said, the same bones, the same curves, the same rises and falls. She said she had not driven it in years, but she still remembered every mile. She asked me to say hello to the road for her when I reached the mountains. I promised I would. I left Fernley and continued west, the road running parallel to the interstate for a while, then veering off to the south. The interstate was always visible in the distance, a straight line of cars and trucks moving at high speed. It seemed like another world, a world of efficiency and speed and purpose. But I was on the old road, which meandered and curved, following the contours of the land rather than slicing through them. It was a slower way to travel, but it felt more honest, more connected to the earth. I could feel the rise and fall of the terrain in my bones, the way the road adjusted to the hills and valleys rather than forcing them into submission. It was a road built by people who had walked the land before they drove on it, who had chosen the path of least resistance, the natural route that followed the water and the wind. The road passed through a stretch of desert that was dotted with the ruins of old homesteads. There were stone foundations, collapsed roofs, rusted farm equipment, and the skeletal remains of fences. I stopped at one of them, a small house that had been built into the side of a hill. The walls were made of stone, the roof was gone, and the windows were empty sockets that stared out at the desert. I walked inside, stepping over fallen timbers and piles of rubble. The floor was dirt, and in the corner I found a rusted cast-iron stove, its door hanging open. There was a piece of pottery on the ground, a shard of a clay cup, and I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. It was rough and old, and I wondered who had held it last, what they had drunk from it, and whether they had found what they were looking for in this harsh and beautiful land. I put the shard back where I found it, feeling like I had disturbed something sacred. As I drove on, I thought about the people who had tried to make a life here, who had come to Nevada hoping to find gold or silver, or simply a piece of land they could call their own. The desert was unforgiving, and most of them failed. They left behind the ruins of their dreams, the crumbling walls and the rusted tools, and the road carried their memory forward. I was driving through a cemetery of hopes, a landscape littered with the remains of those who had tried and lost. But there was a kind of beauty in it, a stark and melancholy beauty that I could not look away from. The road itself was a testament to the same ambition, the same desire to conquer the desert, and it too was crumbling, returning to the earth from which it was made. And yet it still served its purpose, still carried travelers from one place to another, still held the stories of those who traveled it. That was what the old man had meant, I thought. The road says you are here, because the road is a reminder that we are always here, in the present moment, even as the past fades and the future approaches. By early afternoon, I reached the town of Lovelock again, or rather, I reached the area where the road loops back toward it after a long detour through the hills. I did not stop this time. I had seen Lovelock, and I had miles to go before the mountains. The road stretched out ahead of me, a silver ribbon in the afternoon sun. The heat shimmered, and the landscape seemed to pulse and breathe. I saw a herd of wild horses in the distance, their manets and tails streaming in the wind. They stood still, watching me pass, then turned and galloped away, disappearing into a fold in the hills. I felt a surge of something like joy, a recognition that even in this abandoned, forgotten place life persisted. The horses were not tame, not owned, not bound to the road or the towns. They were free as the road itself. The highway began to climb again, entering the Stillwater Range, a chain of mountains that ran north to south, separating the desert basins. The road twisted and turned, gaining elevation with every mile. The air cooled, and the sagebrush gave way to pinyon pines and junipers. The road was rough, washboard in places, and I had to slow down to keep the car from bouncing off the road. I did not mind. The slower I went, the more I saw. I noticed the wildflowers that grew along the roadside, tiny yellow blooms that seemed to have sprouted from the gravel itself. I noticed the patterns of the rocks, the way the light fell on the mountainsides, the way the shadows deepened in the draws and canyons. I was not in a hurry. There was no destination that mattered more than the journey itself. At the top of a pass, I pulled over and got out to take in the view. I could see for miles in every direction, the desert basins spread out below me like a map. The old highway wound its way down the other side of the mountain, a thin line that disappeared into the distant haze. The sky was a deep, clear blue, and the air was so clean it burned in my lungs. I sat on a rock and ate a sandwich, watching the clouds drift overhead. There was no sound except the wind and the occasional call of a hawk circling in the thermals. I stayed there for a long time, feeling the sun on my face and the stone beneath me. I thought about the old man and the shard of pottery and the wild horses. I thought about Ruth and her shattered car and her small block of marble. I thought about the families who had crossed this land, the miners who had died seeking their fortunes, the travelers who had passed this same spot, perhaps pausing to eat a sandwich and stare out at the endless view. And I thought about how the road connects us, not just across space, but across time. We are all travelers on the same road, even if we travel it centuries apart. I finished my sandwich and stood up, brushing the dust from my pants. I walked back to the car and got in, but I did not start the engine right away. I sat there looking out at the landscape, feeling the weight of the moment. Then I turned the key and started down the other side of the mountain, following the road as it descended into the next valley. The way ahead was long, but I was not tired anymore. The road had given me something, a kind of clarity, a sense of purpose. I was not just driving to reach the California border. I was driving to be present, to listen, to add my own small thread to the tapestry of the highway. The valley below was called Dixie Valley, a broad, flat expanse that stretched for miles. The road ran straight across it, arrow straight, with nothing on either side but sagebrush and salt flats. I could see for miles in both directions, the road stretching out before and behind me like an endless line. I drove for an hour across the valley, the car's engine humming a steady rhythm. The sky was immense, a dome of blue that seemed to press down on the land. I felt small, insignificant, a speck of dust moving across a vast and ancient surface, but I did not feel lost. The road kept me oriented, kept me moving, kept me connected to the world beyond the horizon. At the far end of the valley, the road began to climb again, this time into the Augusta Mountains, a range that was lower and more eroded than the Stillwaters. The road was even rougher here, the asphalt cracked and broken in places, the shoulders soft and unstable. I had to navigate carefully, picking my way through the worst sections. In some places, the road was barely wide enough for a single car, and I had to slow to a crawl to avoid scraping the undercarriage on the exposed rocks. This was a road that demanded attention, that required the driver to be fully present, to engage with the terrain in a way that the interstate never did. I found that I was enjoying it, this challenge, this dance with the road. I emerged from the Augusta Mountains into a valley that was greener than the others, with more trees and a small river running through it. This was the Reese River Valley, a place that had been a major route for the Pony Express and the overland stage. The road followed the river for a while, passing through stands of cottonwood and willow. The river was low, its water clear and cold, and I stopped to fill my water bottle and splash my face. The water was bracing, and it woke me up more than the coffee had. I crouched by the river's edge, watching the water flow over the smooth stones. I thought about the Pony Express riders who had galloped along the same route, changing horses at stations every 10 or 15 miles. They had been young men, mostly barely more than boys, who had ridden through the desert and the mountains, through blizzards and heat waves, carrying the mail from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California. The route was dangerous, and many of them died, killed by bandits or weather or simple exhaustion. But they had kept riding because the mail had to get through, and the road had carried them just as it carried me now. I drove on, the sun beginning to sink toward the western horizon. The sky turned gold and pink and deep orange, and the shadows grew long. I reached the town of Ione, a place that had once been a bustling mining camp, but was now little more than a collection of old buildings and a few residents. The road passed through the center of town, past a saloon that looked like it had not changed since the 1880s. I stopped and went inside, ordering a beer from the bartender, a man of about 70 with a gnarled face and a quiet way of speaking. He told me the saloon had been in continuous operation since 1863, that the bar itself had been brought around Cape Horn and hauled across the Isthmus of Panama, then shipped up the coast and carried by wagon into the mountains. He said the building had survived fires and floods and the decline of the mining industry, and that it would probably outlast him. I drank my beer and looked at the old photographs on the wall, images of miners and mule teams and women in long dresses. The road had brought all of them here, and the road had taken most of them away. I left Joni as the last light faded, driving into the night once more. The road was dark, the stars bright, and the only sound was the wind and the engine. I was getting closer to the California border, closer to the end of the journey, but I was not in a hurry. I wanted to savor these last miles, to let the road speak to me one final time. The highway climbed into the Shoshone Range, a rugged stretch of mountains that marked the boundary between the Central Desert and the Sierra Nevada foothills. The road was steep and winding, the curves tight, the drop-offs sheer. I drove carefully, my headlights illuminating the road ahead, the trees that clung to the slopes, the occasional glimpse of a valley far below. I felt like I was flying, suspended in the dark, moving through a world that had no beginning and no end. And then just before midnight, I saw a sign. It was old and faded, pockmarked with bullet holes, but I could still read the words, California State Line, 1 mile. I slowed down, feeling a mix of emotions, relief and sadness, and a strange sense of accomplishment. I had driven the forgotten highway across Nevada, from Wendover to the border, following the path of the pioneers and the ghosts of the past. I pulled over at the state line and got out, standing in the middle of the road, 1 foot in Nevada and 1 in California. The highway continued into California, but it was different there, better maintained, perhaps less forgotten. But here on this line, it was still the old road, the one that had carried me through 2 days of driving, through sun and wind and dark, through encounters with strangers and ruins and wild horses. I stood there for a long time, listening to the silence, feeling the road beneath my feet. And I heard it, faint but clear, the whisper of the asphalt. You are here. That was all. That was everything. I got back in the car and crossed into California, the forgotten highway behind me, but not forgotten. Not anymore. I crossed the state line and the asphalt immediately improved, smoothing out into a dark ribbon that curved through the foothills. The transition was abrupt, almost jarring. In Nevada, the road had been a relic, a stubborn survivor of time and neglect. In California, it became something else, a maintained byway, well-signed and graded. But even as the road grew easier, I felt a shift in the air. The desert was behind me now, and the Sierra Nevada rose ahead, a wall of shadow against the stars. I drove for another hour, the headlights sweeping across stands of pine and juniper, the road climbing steadily into the mountains. The temperature dropped and I turned on the heater, grateful for the warmth. I had not planned a specific destination. The journey was the point, not the arrival. But as the road wound higher, I saw a sign for a small town called Bridgeport just off the highway. It was late, nearly 1 in the morning, but the idea of a bed and a hot shower was appealing. I followed the sign into town, a quiet cluster of buildings nestled in a valley. The main street was empty, the storefronts dark, but I saw a motel with a vacancy sign glowing faintly in the night. I pulled into the lot and parked, the engine ticking as it cooled. The motel was old, a single-story building with a wooden porch and a neon sign that buzzed softly. I checked in with a sleepy clerk, a woman in her 60s who handed me a key without asking for a credit card. Room 7, she said, pointing down the porch. It is quiet this time of night. I let myself into the room, a simple space with a bed, a dresser, and a small bathroom. The walls were paneled in dark wood, the carpet thin and worn. It felt like a room from another era, one that had hosted countless travelers over the decades. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. The weight of the journey settled into my bones. I had driven nearly 400 miles across Nevada, following a road that most people had forgotten, and now I was in California, the land of the pioneers, the end of the trail. But it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a pause, a moment of rest before the next road, the next story. I slept deeply, without dreams. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the thin curtains, and I could hear birds outside. I lay still for a while, letting the morning light fill the room. Then I got up, showered, and dressed. I wanted to see Bridgeport in the day, to walk its streets and feel its history. I stepped out onto the porch and breathed in the crisp mountain air. The sky was clear, a deep blue that seemed to stretch forever. The town was waking slowly, a few cars moving along the main street, a man sweeping the sidewalk in front of a cafe. I walked to the cafe and ordered breakfast, coffee and eggs and toast, and sat by the window, watching the town come to life. A woman sat down at the table next to mine, older, with silver hair and a calm, weathered face. She was holding a book and a cup of tea. She nodded at me and said, "You are not from around here." I shook my head and told her I had driven across Nevada, following the old highway. Her eyes lit up. She said she knew that road, that she had driven it many years ago with her husband, before he died. She said they had driven it in an old pickup truck, with a dog in the back and a tent in the bed. She told me about the time they had broken down near Austin and had to wait 2 days for a part, how they had spent the night sleeping under the stars, listening to the coyotes. She said the road had been different then, rougher, emptier, but it had felt like a secret, a path that belonged only to them and the ghosts. I listened, and I felt a kinship with her, a connection across the years. We were both travelers on the same road, even if we had traveled it decades apart. I finished my breakfast and paid. The woman smiled and wished me well, and I walked out into the morning. I did not have a plan. I could drive back to Nevada, follow the highway east, or I could continue west, into the heart of the Sierra. But I felt a pull to go back, to see the road again in the daylight, to say goodbye properly. I got in the car and drove east, crossing back into Nevada within minutes. The asphalt changed again, becoming rough and cracked, and I felt a strange relief. This was still the road I had come to know, the one that demanded attention, that told its stories in every pothole and patch. I drove slowly, savoring the light. The sun was behind me now, casting long shadows ahead. The landscape looked different in the morning, the colors richer, the sagebrush a soft green, the rocks a warm brown. I stopped at the same overlook where I had eaten my sandwich the day before, the place where the road wound through the Stillwater Range. I got out and stood at the edge, looking out over the valley. The wild horses were there again, a small herd grazing near a dry creek bed. They raised their heads as I approached, watching me with a calm, steady gaze. I did not move. I just stood there, letting them see me, letting the moment stretch. After a long minute, they lowered their heads and continued grazing, accepting my presence. I felt honored, as if I had been granted a small gift. I drove on, winding back through the mountains, past the ruins of the homestead and the old gas station, past the name painted on the rock and the silence of the Pony Express station. I stopped at the cemetery near Austin, the one with the faded wooden markers. I walked among the graves, reading the names, some worn smooth by wind and weather. Sarah Ann Jones, died 1867, age 22. Thomas Blackwell, killed by Indians, 1864. Infant daughter of James and Mary Carter, 1860. They were all here, the people who had tried to make a life in this harsh land, who had loved and lost and been buried in the dust. The road had carried them to this place, and the road had left them here. But their stories remained, etched into the stones, whispered in the wind. I reached Austin and stopped for lunch at the same diner. The same waitress was there, and she remembered me. She brought me coffee and a sandwich, and we talked about the road, about how it had changed over the years. She told me that her father had driven the mail route along the highway in the 1950s, that he had known every curve and pothole, every place where the road washed out in spring. She said he used to say that the road was alive, that it breathed and shifted, that it remembered everyone who had traveled it. I nodded. I understood what he meant. After lunch, I headed west again, back toward the California border. The afternoon sun was warm, and the road stretched out before me, familiar now. The curves, the climbs, the long straight sections across the valleys, I knew them all. I drove with a sense of ease, no longer searching, just being present. The road was giving me a farewell, a final gift of clarity and peace. At the end of the highway, just before the state line, I stopped one more time. I pulled over and got out, standing on the gravel shoulder. The road behind me was empty, the road ahead empty. I stood in the middle of the lane, looking back east, toward the desert I had crossed. The mountains were distant, a blue haze on the horizon. The silence was absolute. I listened and I heard it again, the whisper of the asphalt, the voices of the travelers who had come before. They were all there, the pioneers and the miners, the Pony Express riders and the families in their Model TS, the truck drivers and the tourists, the man in the camper van and the woman in the Ford sedan. They were all on the road, moving through time, their stories intersecting in this place. I thought about the shard of pottery in my pocket, the one the old man had given me. I took it out and held it in my hand, feeling its rough edges, its weight. It was a piece of history, a fragment of a life lived 100 years ago. I thought about the hands that had made it, the hands that had used it, the hands that had broken it and left it in the dust. And now it was in my hand, carried across the road, carried through time. I slipped it back into my pocket, a talisman, a reminder. I got back in the car and crossed into California for the last time. The highway ahead was smooth, well-maintained, but I knew I would not follow it far. My journey was ending. The road had given me what I needed, a sense of connection, a feeling of belonging to something larger than myself. I drove to the first exit, a small town called Walker, and pulled into a gas station. I filled the tank and sat in the car, looking at the map on my phone. I could go anywhere, but I did not want to go anywhere. I wanted to sit with the memory of the road, to let it settle. I found a quiet spot by a river and parked. I got out and sat on a rock, watching the water flow. It was a clear, cold stream, fed by snowmelt, rushing over stones. I stayed there until the sun began to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I thought about the forgotten highway, about its silence and its stories, about the people who had built it and the people who had traveled it. It was not forgotten anymore. It lived in me now, a part of my own story. As the light faded, I stood up and walked back to the car. I did not start the engine. I just sat there in the twilight, listening. And in that quiet moment, I understood that the road never really ends. It just continues, somewhere else, under different names, under different skies. The forgotten highway across Nevada was just one thread in a vast network of roads that crisscross the country, the world, the human experience. Every road carries stories, every mile holds memories, and we are all travelers, moving along our own paths, crossing and recrossing, leaving traces of ourselves behind. I turned the key and drove into the evening, the road ahead invisible but felt. I did not need to know where I was going. I was already there. I turned the key and drove into the evening, the road ahead invisible but felt. I did not need to know where I was going. I was already there. But even as that thought settled, the road pulled me forward. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the dark, and I followed it without intention, through the canyon and past the scattered lights of Walker. The river I had sat beside soon faded behind me, replaced by the hum of tires on asphalt and the soft glow of the dashboard. I had no map in my mind, no destination pinned to the horizon. I simply drove, letting the road choose. After a few miles, I came to a crossroads, a junction with a sign pointing south toward Bridgeport and north toward Marcellus. I slowed, indecisive, and then pulled onto the shoulder. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence, listening to the night. The stars were out, a thick blanket of them, unspoiled by city lights. They seemed lower here, closer, as if I could reach up and touch them. I rolled down the window and let the cool air wash over me, carrying the scent of dry grass and pine. I thought about the woman in the diner that morning, the one with the silver hair and the memory of her husband. I thought about the old man who had given me the shard of pottery, the waitress whose father had driven the mail route, the pioneers buried in the cemetery near Austin. Their stories were woven into the road, and now mine was woven in too. I was no longer a visitor. I was a part of the fabric, a thread that would remain long after I had gone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the shard. In the dim light of the car, it was just a shape, a rough triangle of baked clay. But I knew what it held, the echo of a fire, the scent of a meal, the hands of a woman or a man who had lived and died on this land. I turned it over, feeling its coolness, its history. I wondered if it had been part of a bowl or a plate, if it had held water or grain, if it had been broken in anger or by accident. There was no way to know, and that was the beauty of it. The story was incomplete, open to imagination like the road itself. I put the shard back in my pocket and started the engine. I made a decision. I would drive south toward Bridgeport, then cut east again on a smaller road that would take me back into Nevada, a different route than the one I had come. I wanted to see the highway from another angle, to approach it like a friend I already knew but could still surprise me. The night was deep and the roads were empty. I drove for an hour, climbing into the pine forests of the Sierra, the air growing colder, the stars brighter through the trees. In Bridgeport, I stopped at a gas station that was still open, a lone fluorescent island in the dark. A man in a flannel shirt was filling his truck, and he nodded as I walked toward the convenience store. Inside, the clerk was an older woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, watching a small television on the counter. She looked up and smiled as I paid for a bottle of water and a bag of peanuts. "You're out late," she said. "Couldn't sleep," I said. "Or maybe I didn't want to." She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. "You driving the old highway?" she asked. I blinked, surprised. "How did you know?" She shrugged. "People who come through here this time of night, they're usually on their way to or from somewhere that doesn't show up on most maps. You have that look like you've been listening to the road." I smiled. "I guess I have." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about that road. He was a teamster back in the 20s, hauling supplies from Wadsworth to Tonopah. He said the road could break a man or make him, depending on how he treated it. He said you had to respect it because it was older than any of us, older than the state itself." I told her about the artifacts I had seen, the names painted on the rocks, the graves, the abandoned homesteads. She listened, her eyes far away as if she were seeing them herself. Then she said something that stayed with me long after I left. "The road isn't forgotten," she said. "It's just waiting. It knows that people will come back sooner or later. They always do." I thanked her and walked out into the night. The man in the flannel shirt had gone, and the gas station stood alone under the stars. I got back in the car and turned onto a narrow road that headed east, climbing out of the valley and into the darkness of the Toyabe National Forest. The road was gravel now, then dirt, then nothing but twin ruts through the sagebrush. I drove slowly, the headlights bouncing over rocks and dips. This was the kind of road that demanded full attention, the kind that could swallow a car or a life without a trace. But I trusted it. I felt a strange safety, as if the road itself was guiding me, keeping me from harm. After what felt like an hour, I came to a flat expanse where the ruts disappeared into a broad, dry lake bed. I stopped the car and turned off the lights. The darkness was absolute, a velvet blackness that pressed against the windshield. I stepped out and stood on the cracked earth, the salt flats crunching under my boots. The stars were so thick they seemed to form a dome, a celestial ceiling that rotated slowly overhead. I tilted my head back and let the silence wash over me. In that moment, I understood something that had been building throughout the journey. The forgotten highway was not just a road. It was a threshold, a place where time folded back on itself, where the past and present coexisted. Every traveler who had crossed it left a trace, a whisper that lingered in the dust, in the wind, in the bones of the land. and every traveler who came after could hear those whispers if they were willing to listen. I knelt down and placed my hand on the salt flat. The surface was cool and rough, ancient. I thought about the people who had crossed this same expanse 100 years ago, on foot, on horseback, in wagons. They had looked up at these same stars, felt the same silence, carried the same hopes and fears. We were connected, not by blood or name, but by the shared experience of crossing this place, of being small under a vast sky. I stood up and walked back to the car. But before I got in, I took the shard of pottery from my pocket and held it in my palm. I considered leaving it here on the salt flat, returning it to the earth, but something stopped me. It was not mine to abandon. It had been given to me, entrusted to me, and I had a responsibility to carry it forward. I would keep it as a reminder, not of the road, but of the people who had made the road possible, those who had built, traveled, and died on it. I got back in the car and drove on, the salt flats giving way to gravel, the gravel to pavement, until I was once again on the forgotten highway, the one I had come to know so well. The first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of lavender and gold. I pulled over at a familiar overlook, the one where I had seen the wild horses the day before. They were not there now, but the valley was still beautiful, still silent, still waiting. I sat on the hood of the car and watched the sun rise. The colors deepened, the shadows lengthened, and the road below me emerged from the darkness, a thin gray ribbon stretching across the desert. It looked exactly as it had when I first saw it, and yet it was completely different. I had changed. I had become part of its story. I took out my phone and snapped a photograph, not to share online, but to keep for myself, a reminder of this moment, this place, this feeling. Then I put the phone away and sat in silence, letting the morning unfold around me. After a while, I drove on, heading east toward the town of Fallen, then north toward Interstate 80. I could have taken the interstate, but I chose to stay on the old highway, following it as far as it would go. The pavement eventually merged with a newer road, the markings faded, the signs replaced. But I knew it was still there, beneath the modern surface, the same road that had carried the Pony Express, the 49ers, the families in their Model TS. I reached a point where the highway ended, literally, at a gate marked no trespassing. Beyond it, the road continued as a faint trace through the desert, disappearing into the distance. I stopped and got out, standing at the gate. The road was not forgotten, but it was no longer used, no longer maintained. It had become a ghost, a memory. I touched the gate, cold and rusted, and thought about the woman in the diner, the clerk in Bridgeport, the old man who had given me the shard. They had all known that the road was more than asphalt and gravel. It was a vessel for stories, a keeper of time, and now I knew it too. I turned back and got into the car. The engine started and I took one last look at the gate, the fading road beyond it, the mountains on the horizon. Then I shifted into reverse and backed away, turning onto the paved road that led back to the modern world. The forgotten highway across Nevada was behind me but not gone. It would stay with me, woven into my memory, a thread in the larger fabric of my own journey. I drove home through the afternoon, the sun warm on my arm, the radio playing softly. The road ahead was familiar, but I saw it differently now. Every mile was a story. Every curve was a possibility. And I knew that somewhere under the stars, the forgotten highway was still waiting, still whispering its secrets to anyone who cared to listen. It would always be there, a silent testament to the lives that had passed over it, a bridge between the past and the present, a reminder that the road never ends, it just continues in different forms in different hearts. I arrived home as dusk fell. I parked the car and sat for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. I reached into my pocket and felt the shard, smooth and warm. I did not take it out. I left it there, a quiet companion, a piece of the road I carried with me. And as I stepped out of the car and walked toward my door, I smiled, knowing that the journey was not over. It had simply become a part of who I was. The forgotten highway across Nevada was no longer a place on a map. It was a place inside me.